This week, I'm going to show you how I edit and compile my time-lapse sequences. Last week I showed you how to photograph a time-lapse sequence. If you haven't seen this yet, click on the eye in the corner. That'll take you to a link to this video. Now I'm going to show you how to take all of these images and compile them into a short clip. There are lots of different ways to compile a time-lapse on your computer. This is how I do it. As I said last week, I always shoot my photographs in RAW. This gives me much more latitude when editing. It is a two-stage process. I use Lightroom to edit the photos and then Premiere Pro to compile these photos into a sequence. I'll also show you how to compile them in Photoshop if you don't use Premiere Pro. First of all, you need to import your photos. I import them onto an external hard drive and then I'll add them to the Lightroom catalog. I'm assuming that you know how to do this already. If not, click on the eye in the corner to one of my other videos. In this, I go through my whole Lightroom workflow. When shooting time lapses, you'll come across the point where your camera will get to its counting limit. So it will get to 9,999. It'll revert back to 0 and then save these images in a new folder. So you can see here, I've already transferred them across to my hard drive, but I've got these 3 files. You can see in this one, it's reached 9999. Then in this next one, it starts at 0001. Just remember in your library module to have this sort down here to capture time. Then your sequence will appear in order. Once you've imported your shots into Lightroom, just check along the bottom here to make sure they're in the right order. You can see in the navigator, if you flick through them, it'll show you a jumpy version of the time-lapse that you've got. If you've gone out and shot a time-lapse yourself, I'm assuming that the exposure has stayed relatively constant through your sequence. If it hasn't, or if you've shot through a sunset from day to night, you'll probably need a bit of software called LR Time-Lapse. This will help even out the exposures. What I'm going to do is edit the first photo and then synchronize all of the photos to have the same edit. So I'll go to the first image, I'll go to the develop module, and I'll edit this image. The sky was quite bright and the ground was a lot darker, so the dynamic range was huge. So I exposed for the highlights, and then I'm going to bring back my shadows. Basically, when I'm editing, I'll start from the top and work my way through all of these settings. One thing I do first is enable profile corrections. This just gets rid of distortions that the lens might cause. Then I'll start at the top. I've just done a light edit on this photo, but just enough to bring the shadows up and drop the highlights down and make the colors pop a little bit. Once you've edited this first photo, you'll want to sync these changes throughout the whole sequence and keep them exactly the same. I'll select all of the images by pressing Command A or Ctrl A if you're on a PC. Then down here on the right-hand bottom corner, you'll see this sync button appear. So click on that sync button, click on Check All, and click Synchronize. This will add all of these changes to every single photo in that sequence. Once I've synced all of the images, I'll click halfway through the sequence and see how that looks. And then I'll click at the end of the sequence, and that looks all right as well. There's no real clipping of the highlights or crushing of the shadows, so the sequence is good to go. Once you're happy with how this looks, it's time to export the images. So to do this, make sure they're all selected and click on File, Export. I'll have Export to Choose Folder later. This means this will be the last step that I do in this process. I'll always rename it to a custom name and a sequence. So this could be Burj Khalifa. It's important to have this custom name and sequence, especially if your camera has recorded the images into separate folders. Then it'll put them in the correct order, from 1 to however many you have. Next, as you come down, I'll have image format to JPEG, quality to 100. I won't resize the images because I want to keep all of that detail. I might want to crop in on a certain part of the time lapse, and I can do this later in Premiere Pro. If I haven't sharpened it, I'll keep sharpening on. This is personal preference. And none of the others are selected. So then I'll click on Export. It's important at this point to have a separate folder for each time-lapse sequence. This will come clear later on when you create an image sequence from these photos. So open that and export them. This export process might take a while because it's got so many images to process. So now it's time to go and get a cup of tea or a coffee. Once the export is complete, open up Premiere Pro. If you're compiling the sequence in Photoshop, click to this time here. What I'm going to do is just create a new project for this sequence. When you open up Premiere Pro, you'll have your project. This is where all your files will be kept. In here, I'll right click, click on New Bin. Bins are basically folders within Premiere Pro. So I'll name this Time-Lapse. I'll right click on this, import. I'll find where I put those images. It's in Output, Burj Khalifa. So you can see it's a JPEG sequence and it's numbered those from 1 to 148. So I'll click on the first one and on Options, click on Image Sequence. Then click on Import. So now we have this Burj Khalifa sequence. It gives us the frame rate and further along it'll give us the resolution. So if you're adding it to another video, make sure it's at the same frame rate as those other videos. The most important thing when you're compiling videos in Premiere Pro or any editing software is to have the frame rate exactly the same from when you import it to when you work on your timeline, right through to when you export it. If you keep this frame rate the same throughout, you won't get that jumpy looking video. Next, I would drag this to the timeline. There you go, it's there, we have our viewer. When you create a timeline from one of these sequences, it'll generally make the timeline the same frame rate as your clip. The problem with this is the resolution is huge. So I'm going to go to Sequence Settings and then change this to 1080. Now you can see how big this image is. So with the 1080 timeline, it's cropped right in. If I select Effects Controls, I can change the size of the image with this. One other thing to note, as I was taking photographs, it saved them in a 4:3 crop. I want them in a 16:9 crop. So I'll zoom in until I fill the frame. What this does is it gives me the ability to move the frame around. With this shot, I'll get the Burj Khalifa top to bottom in frame. Then I can play the sequence. Because the image is so big, it'll be quite choppy in this because it's reading every single one of those 40 megapixel images. What I'll tend to do is bring it in Premiere Pro, edit it like this, output it as a movie file, and then I'll bring it back in on the timeline that I'm editing on. So this is almost like creating a proxy file of the time lapse that's easier to edit. Once you've framed it to where you want it, then you can either output it as a still time lapse, or you can change the scale of it. You can do this by clicking on Scale and this little toggle animation. So I'll zoom in a touch and I'll probably move the position as well. So I'll zoom out from that to 24. At this point, you shouldn't need to do any color correction. If you've got all the colors right in Lightroom, it should be fine as it is. Sometimes you'll find if you're adding a time lapse to some other recorded video, you may need to balance out the colors, but you shouldn't need to do too much to it. Once it's on your timeline and you're happy with it, whether you're pushing in or pulling out or doing a fake slider movement, now it's time to output the time lapse into a video file. So click on File, Export, Media. When you get to this screen, click on Presets, and then choose what you want. I had a 1080 timeline, so I'm going to click on YouTube 1080 HD. Then what I'll do is I'll just check the settings. output 1920 by 1080 at 25 frames a second. One other thing I'll change is the bitrate encoding. I tend to set it to VBR 2 pass, and that's it. Make sure you know where it's going. So I'm going to put it into this time-lapse folder. Just going to save it as Burj Khalifa. And now I'll export. This may take a while, so it's time to take a break. If you don't have Premiere Pro, but you have Photoshop, there's a way to do it in that as well. So I'll just quit Premiere Pro and I'll open up Photoshop. Then click on Open and then find out where those images are. At this point, click on Options and click on Image Sequence and then Open. Then it'll ask for the frame rate. So this shows how important frame rate is. When you bring an image sequence into Photoshop, that's the first thing it asks you. I output everything in 25 frames a second, so I'm going to keep it at 25 frames a second. Now you can see I've got this timeline open along the bottom already. If it isn't open, click on Window and make sure Timeline is ticked. I have it here already, so I don't need to click on that. Next, I want to crop the image to 16 by 9. So click on this crop tag and up here, choose 16 by 9. What you need to do is move the image to the point where you want it. I'm going to just have it there and then crop. With Photoshop, I'm going to keep it as a static time lapse. This image that I've taken works a little bit better as a static image. Once I've done that, I'll file, then export, and then render video. I'll name it Burj Khalifa MP4. I'll select the folder I want to put it in. You can see the format, H.264. We'll keep it at that. So the size, I'm going to change to 1920 by 1080. I'll make sure the frame rate is the same, so it's 25 frames a second. I'll keep the fill order as progressive, the aspect as square, and they'll have all frames. Then I'll render. Again, this may take a while depending on how fast your computer is. And that's about it. The most important thing is to keep your frame rate the same from import to export. As well as this, just take your time in editing the colors in Lightroom to make the images pop. Then you'll get a really good looking time lapse. As always, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And for weekly tutorials, hints and tips in photography and videography, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one.